And today we're beginning a series where we will be going through the second part of the book of Daniel. Daniel chapter 6. The book of Daniel can be divided into two parts, defined by their literature type. The first 6 chapters are narratives. They are stories. And the final are apocalyptic. The first 6 chapters are the history of Israel and Babylon as told from the ground perspective, while the last 6 chapters are the history of Israel as told from God's perspective. And last week we talked about what is Revelation, is seeing things from God's perspective. So the first part of the book is Israel's history from Israel's perspective in Babylon, while the second part is Israel's history from God's perspective. And in addition, this book is also divided politically. The first 5 chapters occur while Babylon is in power, while the 7 occur while the Medes and the Persians are in power. And sandwiched right in the middle of the book, because remember, chapters don't really matter because the Bible wasn't written with chapters and verses. So that's a little bit irrelevant, but you kind of get the picture. But sandwiched right in the middle of the book is chapter 6, which is where we are beginning today. It is the final narrative of the book of Daniel, but it's the first spoken from Persia. And the story fits so perfectly right in the middle that some have come to believe that the book is structured like a chiasm. And for those who don't know what chiasms are literary devices in which ideas are presented and then repeated or inverted in a symmetrical mirror-like structure. To think of it, think idea A, idea B, idea C, and then you say the same thing in reverse. Idea C, idea B, idea A. And then it ends up looking kind of like an X, which is the Greek letter chi, which is why it's called a chiasm. And chiasms are used throughout the Bible to clarify. They're used to emphasize key ideas or themes. But often, biblical authors will bring ideas to an apex, right in the middle of the chiasm, an apex in the middle, to emphasize a message. Because we have spoken about this in the past, about how ancient languages do not have punctuation the way modern languages have now. In modern English, we will use bold, we will use italics, we will underline, we will use exclamation points. We have different ways of emphasizing things. So how does one do that when those grammatical opportunities are not there? Well, you have to structure things in ways to highlight what you are trying to say. And chiasms can be as short as one verse or as long as an entire book. And while Daniel is not a perfect textbook chiasm, we must notice the structure of the book and how at the center is the final narrative in the first year of Persia. And the fact that it's at the center tells us that Daniel is trying to communicate something important, something significant to us throughout the entire story. And maybe what he's trying to tell us is, hey, this is the purpose of the entire book. If you can catch the point of this story right in the middle of the book, you've understood it all. And so what is that story? The 5th chapter of Daniel leads directly into chapter 6. It bleeds right into it. Chapter 5 ends with the death of Belshazzar, the fall of Babylon to the Medes and the Persians. The kingdom of the great kings of Babylon came crumbling down to dust. The great walls were breached, their lands were taken, and their culture was assimilated. And as Darius begins in chapter 6 of Daniel, begins to reorganize the government, this is what it tells us. Read verse 1 through 3 with me. It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps, which is simply a governor. 120 governors to be throughout the whole kingdom, and over them 3 high officials, of whom Daniel was one, to whom of these satraps would give account, so that the king might suffer no loss. Then this Daniel became distinguished above all the other high officials and satraps, because an excellent spirit was in him. And the king planned to set over him the whole kingdom. What was the king planning to do? Give him the kingdom. Notice what happens here. Babylon had fallen, and a new king, Darius the Mede, appointed Babylon. He appointed Babylon's prime minister as one of his trusted officials, second only to himself. Does no one see the problem with that? This is like Russia taking over the United States and then setting our vice president second only to Putin. Moreover, Daniel is in the sunset of his life. Now, look, I know 80 is not old. 80 is the new 20. I know it. But in the time of the Bible, 80 is pretty old. You know, he's in the sunset of his life. He was a young boy when he was taken into exile into Babylon. He spent how many years in Babylon? 70. So he is at least 80 years old right now. But Darius saw something special in Daniel, because throughout his career in Babylon, Daniel had been a man of integrity, a man of honesty, a man who faithfully carried out his responsibilities both to the Babylonian kingdom and to God. But why was Daniel so faithful to Babylon? In Jeremiah chapter 29, verse 7, it says this. This is what God commanded the Israelites to do while in Babylon. He told them in Jeremiah 29, verse 7, seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. What were they to do? Seek its peace and prosperity. And he continues, pray to the Lord for it. Pray for the Babylonians. Pray for it. Because of it, if it prospers, if Babylon prospers, you will prosper also. And then we get to the famous verse 11. For I know the plans that I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you a hope in the future. Then you will call me and come and pray to me, and I will listen to you. You will seek me and find me, and when you seek me with all your heart, I will be found by you. God is telling them, bless the Babylonians, and I will bless you. Pray for them. And if you pray for them, when you seek me, you're going to find me. Despite his sour circumstances, he trusted God's promise of a better future, remained faithful to God, and obeyed God's command to be a blessing to his enemies. That sounds kind of familiar, kind of like Jesus, right? Being a blessing to your enemies. He knew that settling down in Babylon did not mean he had to abandon or forget who he was. You see, Darius did not prize Daniel's reputation as a trustworthy man of integrity because of his loyalty to Babylon. It's not like the king said to himself, wow, look how loyal this Jew is to the king of Babylon. If he's that loyal to the king of Babylon, he'll be that loyal to me. That's not what Darius is praising about Daniel. Because had that been the case, Darius would have probably killed him for being a Babylonian nationalist. Weren't all of the Babylonian generals faithful to the king? But they were all probably killed. But not Daniel. No, Daniel's reputation was prized because from the beginning, Daniel made it clear who he was. Daniel made it clear who his God was and what his boundaries were. He had made it clear that he was willing to die before compromising who he was. If he was successful in Babylon, it wasn't because he was kissing the Babylonian king's butt. But if they would entertain him, he would commit himself to be a blessing to them. And they had no reason to question his integrity, considering how he continued to serve faithfully and love them even after they tried to murder him in a fiery furnace. God delivered him, he held no grudge, and he continued to bless Babylon as God had commanded of him to do. So because of this, and I don't want us to miss this, Darius knew that Daniel was not a bought man. Darius knew that Daniel was not a bought man. The king knew that he could depend on Daniel's word. He knew Daniel served Babylon not because he loved Babylon, but because he loved his God. The king knew that Daniel would serve him just as faithfully as he had done the kings of Babylon, only because his loyalties was only to his own God. You see, most people trust a person who is wholly committed to their cause. Am I right? But in Daniel's case, it was the opposite. The kings of Babylon and Darius the Mede trusted Daniel because of the opposite. They trusted him because of his faithfulness. If anything was predictable about Daniel, it was that he would never compromise who he was. And as we would expect, the satraps and the governors became jealous of Daniel. And it's possible that they thought to themselves, it's possible that they reasoned inside of their souls, why is this old man set over us? Isn't he a holdover from the Babylonians? He's not even Babylonian. He is an exile from one of those no-name nations that they took over. As with any exile, we can't trust him. He's trying to get back home. He's trying to get back to his people. He's trying to get back to his gods. What right does he have to command us and to rule over our people? He has no loyalty to Babylon. He has no loyalty to Media. He has no loyalty to Persia. He won't eat our food. He won't bow down to our gods. And you're telling me that he's allowed to judge over us and tell us what to do? And the more they thought about it, the angrier and more envious they became. I want us to read verse 4 together. Let's read verse 4 in Daniel 6. It says, "Then the high officials and the satraps sought to find a ground for complaint against Daniel with regard to the kingdom. But they could find no ground for complaint or any fault, because he was faithful and no error or fault was found in him." If they had computers, and computers are like a blessing, but they're also a curse, eh? Like if they had computers and social media, they would have read all his tweets. They would have looked through all his Instagram posts and dug for archived footage of interviews, television, and radio appearances. They would have gone through his tax reports and interrogated his inferiors. Had he ever badmouthed the king or the empire? Had he ever mistreated women, servants, widows, orphans, and immigrants? Had he ever shown partiality to skin color, nationality, culture, or religion? Had he ever acted in self-interest over the nation or over his faith? Was there anything that could condemn his character, even if it was in the past? Because if there was, it was enough. But they searched high, they searched low for something to condemn him, but they found nothing. Daniel's faithfulness had not only benefited himself, but it had also benefited the nations. His faithfulness was practical with real-world implications. If he was guilty of anything, it was about being consistent. Imagine trying to condemn a person who's made you better. They can't find anything on him. So finding nothing wrong with his life, read verse 5 with me. Daniel chapter 6, verse 5. They said, "We shall not find any ground for complaint against this Daniel unless we find it in connection with the law of his God." In other words, we can't condemn him on the basis of our own law because he's been blessing us too much. What we have to do is see, maybe he's doing something wrong in his own religion. Or maybe we can trap him with his own religion. Verse 6, "Then these high officials and satraps came by agreement to the king and said to him, 'O King Darius, live forever. All the high officials of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps, the counselors and the governors are agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an injunction that whoever makes petition to any god or man for 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions.'" Really? All the governors said this is a great idea? All of them? Clearly they're lying, because Daniel would have never agreed to this. Verse 8. "Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document so that it cannot be changed, according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked." Therefore, King Darius signed the document and the injunction. And let's keep reading. How did Daniel respond? "When Daniel knew that the document had been signed, he went to his house, where he had windows in his upper chamber open towards Jerusalem. He got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God as he had what? As he had always done." It's a wonderful thing when you have nothing to hide. And Daniel refused to have a secret life. And we know the rest of the story, right? We know the rest of the story. The king realizes his mistake. Daniel is condemned and thrown into the lion's den. God shuts the mouth of the lions and saves Daniel. And when Daniel is found alive and well in the morning, his accusers throw him into the pit. They throw his accusers into the pit and they are devoured. And the story ends by telling us that Daniel, in his old age, prospered. So what is this story about? Why did Daniel put this story at the center of the book? What does this story tell us about the entire book of Daniel? Now, here's the main idea. Here's the big point. Here's the thing. If you go home and they're like, "What did the pastor talk about?" This is the answer you're going to give them. I'm telling it to you right now. If they say, "What did Pastor Alex talk about?" This is the one line right here. What is the whole book of Daniel about? The story is about a God who rewards faithfulness. The whole book of Daniel is about a God who rewards faithfulness. And I'm not saying that our works save us. We are saved by grace through faith, but our salvation requires an adequate response. Salvation does not come with strings attached, but we're not saved in order to be left exactly the same. We're not saved only to continue living as we have always been living. We are saved to be reborn into a new life, a life that brings honor to God and blesses the world. If God gives us grace and mercy, we are faithful to give grace and mercy. If God gives us love, we are faithful to give love. If we are forgiven, we are faithful to forgive others. If we are if we are given truth of the gospel, we are faithful to share that truth. If God gives us rest through Sabbath, we are faithful to rest. If God gives us purpose, we are faithful not to return to vanity. And if we sin by any chance and make mistakes, we are faithful to return to Him, who is our advocate to receive grace and mercy. I want us to consider the context of Daniel. Why is Israel in Babylon? Why is Israel in Babylon, my friends? Why has the kingdom and the land been stripped from their hands? It's because they had been unfaithful. It is because they had become proud, selfish, self-reliant, and unjust. And what have the first 5 chapters of Daniel taught us? In chapter 1, the 3 Hebrews are made wise and promoted for their faithfulness. In the 2nd chapter, Daniel interprets the king's dream and is again promoted for his faithfulness. In the 3rd chapter, the 3 Hebrews are thrown into a fiery furnace for their faithfulness, but God saves them because of their faithfulness. And in the 4th chapter, Nebuchadnezzar is humiliated for his unfaithfulness, but restored when he repents. And in the 5th chapter, Babylon finally sees the writing on the wall because of their unfaithfulness. The first half of the book are stories of faithfulness from Babylon. And the latter part of the book turns to what God sees. Because if we are to see what God sees, if we want to see what God sees, we are first to be faithful. And what is the call? What is the challenge of the apocalypse of Daniel that is about to come through chapter 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11, 12? What is the challenge? It is to continue being faithful with what lies ahead. Hey, if you think Babylon was tough, just wait till you see what God sees is right up ahead. If you want to see what God sees, you must first be faithful. Because it's going to take faithfulness to get through what's coming next. They had learned faithfulness in Babylon, and now they were to continue being faithful. And although that was the message to the Israelites thousands of years ago, the Word of God continues to challenge us today to be faithful. Because is that not the message of Revelation chapter 14, verse 12? Where it says, here is the call for the endurance of the saints, or the patience of the saints, those who keep His commandments and the faith of Jesus. Daniel challenges us to keep being faithful. But there needs to be an application to this. Because what does faithfulness look like? What does it actually look like to live a life that is faithful in the context of Daniel? Because if you speak to most Christians, or maybe from our tradition, faithfulness looks like keeping all the rules. Faithfulness means believing all the right things. Faithfulness means you don't go out on Sabbath. Faithful means you don't drink certain things or eat certain things. That's what faithfulness looks like, and that's always the perspective that is taken on it. But as the minor prophets tell us, Israel never learned how to get to the heart of the law, which caused them to hurt the marginalized and live only for themselves, only to keep deepening their pockets. we tend to think that we first abandon God before we embrace vice. But when we read Scripture, we find that it was only after the Israelite elite hurt the weak and fattened their wallets that they finally abandoned God. In the Gospels, the Pharisees, albeit more sanctimoniously, were doing the same thing while claiming to be religious. But in the book of Daniel, we meet Daniel and his 3 friends who perfectly live out what it means and what it looks like to be faithful. Obeying the law, they loved the people around them. Daniel shows us that faithfulness has a real world impact that doesn't only impact us. Faithfulness is not just obeying rules. It's living out the purpose of rules. You guys understand what I'm saying? Faithfulness is not just obeying rules. It's living out the purpose of rules. It's not just about worshiping God, but it's about healing the wounds of those who worship other gods. It's not just about not making graven images, but it's about giving our neighbors something to eat. It's not just about not using the Lord's name in vain, but about using our words to defend, to advocate, and to encourage. It's not just a matter of keeping Sabbath for ourselves, but finding ways to give rest to the widow, the orphan, the slave, and the sojourner. It's not just about honoring father and mother. It's about being a mother and a father to those who don't have one. It's not just about not murdering, but it's about loving our enemies. It's not just about not committing adultery. It's about valuing our relationships and respecting the relationships of others. It's not just about not stealing, but about having abundant generosity. It's not just about not bearing false witness, but it's about delivering good news to people. It's not just about not coveting. It's about desiring success and fortune for others, even when it's not our season. Daniel succeeded because his faithfulness was not only a blessing for himself, but it was also a blessing for others. Our faithfulness can never be selfish. Daniel succeeded because his faithfulness was not only a blessing for himself, it was also a blessing for his enemies. Our faithfulness can never be selfish. As God told Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, verse 2, I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great. And why is God going to bless him? Why is God going to make his name great? He tells him, I'm going to do all of this so that you will be a blessing. That is Genesis chapter 12, verse 2. And Israel never quite figured out how to be faithful in order to be a blessing. They only figured out how to be faithful for themselves. Are we doing it right? Not, how am I doing this right for the benefit of others? So you know what God did to them? He forced them to learn under the yoke of Babylon. As Martin Luther famously said, God doesn't need your good works, but your neighbor does. God doesn't need it. God doesn't need your Sabbath keeping. God doesn't need your abstaining from unclean meats. God doesn't need your not drinking coffee. God doesn't need any of that. God doesn't need you to keep Sabbath. You think he gets tired just because you choose to keep working? God doesn't need it. But you know who does? Your neighbor. Your neighbor needs your good works. In the fourth commandment, when God says, you shall not work, why do we not work? To give the animals and the servants and everyone else rest. We rest so that everyone else can rest. It's not just a matter of us being faithful. It's us being faithful so that others can be blessed. God doesn't need our good works, but our neighbors do. And this is the call of the book of Daniel. Right smack in the middle is a story of Daniel being faithful. But what was his faithfulness? What did his faithfulness look like? His faithfulness existed for the purpose of blessing others. And so comes the message of Daniel. God rewards the faithful. But faithfulness is never selfish. The first 6 chapters are the narratives of the history of Israel and Babylon as told from the ground perspective. In comparison, the last 6 chapters are apocalyptic, the history of Israel as told from God's perspective. But if you want to see what God sees, if you want to see the world, if you want to see the sunsets, if you want to see the skies, if you want to see all of creation, if you want to see your neighbor, if you want to see the world, if you want to see Scripture the way that God sees it, we must be faithful, but faithfulness that is not selfish. And so comes the message of Daniel. God rewards the faithful. Because it's going to take faithfulness for us to get through what's coming. Let your faithfulness be like Daniel's. A faithfulness that blesses the world. Amen.